Okay, welcome to the second part of the lecture. I hope you have watched the TED Talk on how the poor view the world. It is a very interesting TED Talk and left me a big impression. So I always assign it whenever possible to my class students. I hope you like it as much as I do. So we've been talking about the culture of poverty, which focus on describing slum cultures. And how about all the traditional and primitive societies that Rostow was talking about in his modernization theory? So if you remember, and we have already mentioned in the beginning of this lecture, is that modernization theory considers traditional and indigenous culture as obstacle to development. So Rostow used to spend a lot of texts or wordings to describe how the traditional society functions, including how they are happy with self-sufficiency and they are living the same way as their ancestors always do. They value connections to clans and tribes instead of meritocracy or specialized functions. So, and then remember after 1960s, where the modernization theory was popular, we went through dependency theories and world system theories in the 1970s and 1980s. And then we had post-development in the 1990s, which we haven't talked about, which I will talk about it in the last part of the course. But for now, I just want to tell you that the post-development thinkers actually think development is a form of cultural colonization by the West. They think that the concept of development is a Western concept that they impose on the other parts of the world. So, in the 1980s, due to the economic recession and development crisis, there was a new romantic views on indigenous culture. So people start to really look at indigenous culture in a different manner. At the same time, indigenous organizations and their widening measures to establish indigenous right in international and national levels. So you can say that there is a cultural turn in development. People start to pay attention to the importance of culture. I mean, this is not really come out of nowhere, because if you remember in the 1980s, it was also a time where we were talking about the capability approach and also the participatory approach to development. So if you do enough of this kind of on the ground work, you will understand that culture can play an important role in almost everything in our lives. So the new paradigm after the cultural turn for development, there is this one notion of culture for sustainability, meaning that you actually need culture to play a positive role in ensuring sustainable development. So if you remember, also 1990s is the time when neoliberalizations and sustainable development were being advanced in the international agenda. So instead of eliminating culture, development actors start to recognize the importance of culture, especially as important to sustainable development. Because if you remember, sustainable development are propagating, paying equal emphasis to environments, economics, and also social components of societies. So they are actually development actors and funders who fund recuperation of culture. And UNESCO, for example, is a UN agency that also specializes on promoting cultural diversity and preserving cultural integrity of people. So, under the neoliberal agenda, culture has been advanced as being useful as products for entrepreneurship and businesses. For example, some indigenous culture have very beautiful handicrafts, costumes, or their knowledge on medicinal plants, and those are being seen as important resources to advance development under the neoliberal understanding. And also, a lot of the development professionals are talking about culture as a resourceful institutions, because a lot of indigenous culture and local communities have their own kind of governing institutions, like a tribal council. They think that these institutions are very important because they can serve as social capital and a kind of moral economy that is conducive for expanding other kinds of capital. So you can see that while modernization theory defines this indigenous traditional culture as negative, it has now been transformed to become a positive feature. So these are some of the handicrafts. The one on the upper left is from the Andean culture in Peru. And then we have handicrafts in Nepal on the right hand side, and the bottom left hand side is a festival in Nepal. Okay, so in our last slide, we were talking about culture for sustainability. What it meant was that we can appropriate some parts of culture to advance sustainable development. But in the wake of climate change and biodiversity degradation, people actually start to pay attention to so-called traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge, right? So people pay attention to how indigenous people have historically adapted to ecological changes, and some reported how indigenous people have maintained higher biodiversity in the area that they are living in than conservation areas. So in a way, they're trying to say that these cultures are culture of sustainability where we can learn from in order to achieve our own sustainable development. So while many focus on the utility of indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, when you try to extract a very specific kind of indigenous knowledge, you can say that they are actually doing culture for sustainability. But others have attempted to understand how indigenous people view and explain the world, believing that those views might hold the key to sustainability. So then that is a culture of sustainability approach. And so, for example, in the UNU article that I have asked you to read in your class reading, it talks about how storytelling and strategy to counter forest fires are being learned from the indigenous culture around the world in order to adapt to changes, including climate change. However, I'm also asking here, is there a danger of appropriation especially in terms of culture for sustainability? Will there be more and more neoliberal business leaders who try to take advantage of certain cultural aspects and appropriate them to do businesses, such as we had talked about in our last lecture on ecotourism? So will culture for sustainability advance the danger of appropriations? On the other hand, for people who try to look at indigenous culture as culture of sustainability, are they also trying to romanticize a particular culture? Because regardless of what we think, a lot of indigenous people are already experiencing all the changes, social, ecological, and economic changes that brought by outside forces and globalizations. So even though they might not be like the slum communities who are surrounded by people who discriminate them, they were nonetheless discriminated, and they were aware of that in many parts of the world. So by now that we can see that there have been really multiple interpretations of culture in the field of poverty and international development. So when people are interpreting non-modern culture or culture that is different from the middle class in modern society, people have interpreted this different culture as either culture of poverty or culture of sustainability, right? So people in the slums are considered having this peculiar culture of poverty, but indigenous people in the forest who are equally materially deprived are considered to be practicing culture of sustainability. And then we have also people who advance the notion that culture is the cause of poverty, and some other will choose to understand culture as resilience and the results of adaptation. And this can be applied to both slum communities or indigenous communities. And then we really see some people having the opinion that cultural integrity itself is a key to sustainability. If you remember, gross national happiness by Bhutan actually measure cultural participation, your ability to speak the native language, your ability to practice a particular kind of social behavior, and your possessions of certain kind of artistic skills. All of these are considered indicator of cultural resilience. So it was very clear to us that for gross national happiness, cultural integrity is indeed an important indicator by itself. But then, under the neoliberal understanding, people also see cultural components to be having the potential to be extracted and utilized for businesses, income generations, and therefore developments, such as particular kind of handicrafts or medicinal plants, or even things like yoga or certain kind of cultural practices. So I just want to remind you that the approach that look at cultural integrity as key to sustainability is the culture of sustainability approach, and the cultural utility for development is the culture for sustainability approach. And these two approaches of understanding culture is actually very different from each other. I just want to, reflect a little bit on this question: does culture of poverty and culture of sustainability overlap? Because, as I mentioned, we are defining culture. They're different from culture of the middle class of modern society. Lewis was talking about extended family structure in the slum areas, and I can see that's pretty much the indigenous culture too in many parts of the world. And consensual marriage, which means that people just live together without going through proper procedures, and that is kind of also usual for indigenous culture, not just in Islam cultures. And present oriented, because a lot of indigenous culture do not have bank accounts or refrigerator even to store their food, it can be reasonably deduced that they are actually quite present oriented. So it seems rational when you don't have the kind of amenities to think about future, you think about the present. And then spending habits, people of culture of poverty are considered to have irrational or less wise spending habits because they are spending on unnecessary things or they are paying a lot for small quantities. But it seems to me that indigenous culture might be doing the same as well. So the only possible difference that I see between culture of poverty and culture of sustainability is the moral cynicism part. It seems to me that indigenous culture, at least within their own communities, they might have a little bit higher kind of social trust and social integrations, as being argued by Lewis. So I would like to end this lecture with a couple of questions. The first one is, do you think the current understandings of indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge are mostly a culture for sustainability or culture of sustainability approach? And how will these different approaches make a difference to ways of development? So take some time to think about the answer and write it down, and hopefully it can be part of the prompt for your 100-word reflections. And after this lecture, I would like to direct you to another TED Talk talking about what the Amazonian people know, especially about the medicinal plants that modern society people do not know. So I want you to listen to the TED Talk carefully and see whether the speakers is trying to argue for culture for sustainability or a culture of sustainability. So write down your thoughts after the TED Talk so that we can discuss during the synchronous session. Okay, thank you very much for listening to the lecture.